Hello, everyone. I'm Ted Schwaba. I'm here to talk about the genomics of human personality. I was trying to figure out how to plan this talk because I know that for some of you guys, the genomic part is second nature and the personality part is a little bit more odd. And maybe for some people, you have a little bit more of a connection to personality and a little bit less of a connection to genomics. So if at any point I'm talking and you're like, I'm confused, or you have a question that you want to ask or something clarification or an argument you want to have with me, just feel free to raise your hand at any point. I would love to hear your questions throughout. But before I begin, a real brief plug. This spring, I'll be teaching social science genomics, so Sci 992, where I'm going to be basically giving a grad level intro to human genomics research, focusing specifically on social science variables like personality traits and educational attainment and income. And so you can learn how to do basically all the analyses that I'm presenting today. I think it'll be a fun and very interesting conversation, especially if we get some methodological diversity. We've got some people who are from clinical psych who are going to be in the class, and some people who study non-clinical personality variation who are going to be in the class. And so, yeah, we're going to talk a lot about how to use these large public genomic data sets and apply them to research. So things like psychiatric risk and personality traits, if you've ever been interested in, their genetic underpinnings or kind of the gene environment transactions that underlie these traits across the lifespan, please consider this course. Register or email me if you're interested. I'd love to chat further. Cool. So to begin, one major question that I think almost all humans have asked since back in the ancient Greek philosophers are where do our personalities come from? What explains all these major differences we see between people, where there's some people who are sadistic and narcissistic, and then there's other people who are friendly and generous and kind and role models. You see some people who are extremely introverted. Sia, the singer, for a decade, she never showed her face in public, despite being a charting singer. And then other people like Will Smith are extremely extroverted. They're outgoing, they're sociable. They make rap albums that sell very well in the 90s while they have a wonderful TV show going. And so if you look at all this diversity between people, you're thinking about maybe all of the thousands of personality traits, all the maybe descriptors in the dictionary that we have to describe the differences between one another. It turns out that about 50 years of research have shown that individual differences in human personality can be summarized in terms of these 5 broad traits, which we call the big 5. So they are extroversion, which encompasses traits like being sociable, reward sensitive, and assertive; agreeableness, which encompasses being friendly and compliant and warm-hearted; conscientiousness, which describes people who are responsible and productive and gritty; neuroticism, which contains most of the negative emotions, so things like anxiety, depression, emotional lability; and then my favorite big 5 trait, openness to experience, which describes individual differences in creativity and curiosity and being an intellectual. And so once we take all of these thousands of big 5 traits, or all these thousands of traits and squish them into the big 5, we've now got a pretty good grasp actually at the relative balance of nature and nurture. A ton of research on twin studies and comparisons across family members has substantiated that personality traits are about 40% heritable and about 60% due to non-shared environmental factors. That is, environmental factors tend to make people different from one another rather than more similar to one another. So we've got this pie chart, great. But that's not really a very satisfying answer. Just saying, oh yeah, about 40% of personality is nature, about 60% is nurture. That's not really gonna give people the satisfactory answers that they want. So in the last couple of decades, really there have been these major advances in genome-wide association studies and genomic research in general that has actually allowed us to link measured DNA with variation in human traits. But throughout this, personality genomics have really lagged behind other human trait research. In the last 15 years, just looking at kind of the social science areas that I'm in, large consortia have conducted these wonderful genome-wide association studies, or GWAS, of things like educational attainment, psychiatric risk, cognitive ability, these psychologically important variables that are quite useful and have been giving us a lot of information about kind of the genetic underpinnings of human behavior. But for personality, in 2014, Eric Turkheimer wrote, in personality, it is difficult to point to any successes at all from GWASs. So that's what he wrote in 2014. And in the last few decades, we haven't really got much beyond there. So if you're familiar with GWAS research, you know that you need very large sample sizes to be doing any sort of characterization of genetic signal. The most recent psychiatric and educational attainment GWASs have like 1 million participants. But if you want to work with personality data on the big five, well, right now for agreeableness, openness, and conscientiousness, the publicly available sample size is 17,000. There have been no significant genetic associations or significant loci that have replicated across different analyses. We're really still in the dark ages of personality GWAS. So my colleagues and I looked at this and we looked at our network of collaborators and we said, well, let's band together. Let's make a better personality GWAS so we can finally start learning about the genomics of personality. So across 46 different cohorts, we have revived the Genomics of Personality Consortium. So in 2014 was the last Genomics of Personality Consortium, then it disbanded after not really finding much success at all. Nowadays, we've got 130 researchers from 46 different study cohorts, including some of the classic ones that we all know and love in genomics, like 23andMe, the UK Biobank, the Estonian Biobank, the Twins Early Development Sample, this is my favorite because it's just my name, and the Million Veterans Program in the United States. So we've got a bunch of these very large study cohorts participating, leading us to have 1.14 million participants of European-like and African-like genetic ancestry. So compared to the 17,000 participants that were previously available, now we're doing a lot better here. So each participant contributed a DNA sample, and we sequenced those DNA samples, or at least each of the cohorts did, to measure about 10 million genetic variants. Here we're focusing on SNPs, single nucleotide polymorphisms. Those are the genetic variants that vary in about 1% or more of people. So just the common genetic variants. Participants in each of these studies also completed a validated personality questionnaire that was part of the Big Five. So a Big Five questionnaire item for extroversion would be something like, I enjoy loud parties. 1, not at all, to 5, very much. So you'd fill out this questionnaire item, and then there'd be maybe 10 other extroversion items. They get averaged together. You've got an extroversion score for each person. So we looked at each of the Big Five personality traits separately. So it's really 5 GWASs here. And so today I'm going to be talking about results of our first project. It's this huge thing that we've been working on for about 5 years now. We've got a preprint posted on bioRxiv, and we have an invited revision at Nature. So we're doing pretty good here, but we still have to get this thing across the finish line. So I was chatting with some students before, and they said, yeah, most people here know about genome-wide association analyses, but I still have this slide that kind of describes it to people who aren't as familiar with it. So real quickly, on chromosome 6 at position 92,258,010, DNA commonly varies across people. So like 60% of people have A alleles, 40% of the alleles we have are G alleles, and you get 1 allele from each parent. So that means you could inherit an AA, an AG, or a GG at that spot in your DNA. So then our GWAS is essentially asking, in our sample, do people with more Gs at that position in their genome tend to be more or less extroverted on average? We estimate a regression. We control for age, age squared, birth cohort, sex, and genetic ancestry. Personality traits change across the lifespan, so it's really important to control for age, linearly, quadratically, and also birth cohorts in case there are any cohort effects on personality traits. And so, yeah, we find a standardized effect of negative 0.016. In other words, people who inherit 1 more G allele tend to score 0.016 standard deviations lower on extroversion on average. We've got a nice, really low p-value here of 10 to the negative 19th, suggesting that we're pretty darn confident in this effect. But it's a very, very, very small effect. And in fact, yeah, this explains about 1/100th of 1% of the variance in extroversion. And this is one of the biggest individual genetic associations we find with personality. So we're working with some really, really small genetic effects here. Makes a lot of sense that we weren't able to find things when we had 17,000 participants, given that this is about the biggest we can expect to find. But when we do this 10 million times across many of the common genetic variants, 10 million of them, what do we find? Well, here we've got a Manhattan plot of our extroversion GWAS results, 662,000 participants. And here's what we're finding. So on the y-axis here, we've got our negative log of p-value, so basically how many zeros are in the p-value. And on the X chromosome, here's the X chromosome. On the x-axis, we've got the chromosomes. And so we see that these genetic effects are really spread all across the chromosomes. It's a highly polygenic trait. And there's our friend over at chromosome 6, position 92 million. But yeah, we found 258 independent locations with a significant SNP. Previously, I think there were 6 identified in the literature, so we are really increasing the amount of significant associations found. Here's what we get for agreeableness, 39 associations. The biggest gene here is FOXP2, which is related to language development in humans and parrots. Which is kind of funny, language development in parrots is very important. And it turns out that people, who are maybe impaired language development might be a little bit more disagreeable, getting into some more arguments with others. For conscientiousness, we find 131 independent locations with a significant SNP. Up here, we've got CAD-M2, cell adhesion molecule 2. And this gene has actually been related with a small effect size to many, many human impulsivity-related traits. So it's related to externalizing behavior, it's related to lower conscientiousness, it's related to younger age at first sex. It seems like this gene is really linked to this more impulsive behavior. Here's neuroticism. We got 703 lead SNPs here. This is the most highly powered GWAS, thanks to the UK Biobank, which actually measured neuroticism, but not the other big 5 for some reason. Here we've got a lot of immune associations, XKR6, on chromosome 8 here, in the inversion region, which is fun for trying to figure out how the heck DNA works. And then finally, for openness to experience, we have 126 genome-wide associations. So we're finding that personality is massively polygenic, which maybe is no news to you guys, but to some of the people who were doing personality genetics work in the 90s and early 2000s, who had candidate genes and were kind of expecting there to be single genetic variants with giant effect size that could be detected in 200 people, that is not what's happening. Personality is massively polygenic, and when you compare it to other human traits, it's more polygenic than almost every other trait we're looking at. So the polygenicity of personality is higher than things like schizophrenia, than things like other psychiatric disorders. The only thing that's lower than is age at first birth, which as a reproductive related trait, we would expect it to be super polygenic. So now we're cooking with gas. We've got a lot of genetic associations that are significant, and you kind of chart them over time. Here's what it looked like from the first GWAS of personality in 2010, all the way up to 2015, 2016. Thankfully, in 2017, we have the UK Biobank. But really, up to 2024, we haven't really made any progress. And now finally, by banding all of our resources together, we're able to have many, many more significant lead SNPs for each of the big 5. The important thing is not just counting the number of lead SNPs, though, but that is an indicator that we have sufficient power to do all these sorts of fun follow-up analyses to understand human genomics in more detail. So one of those things we can look at is heritability. How heritable is personality traits? How heritable are personality traits? Just from this twin and family research, we have a broad sense heritability of about 40%, but we can also look at the total personality variation tagged by these common genetic variants to get an estimate of SNP-based heritability. So what we did here is we estimated SNP-based heritability in each individual cohort, all of our 46, and then we meta-analyzed our results across all 46 cohorts. And so the meta-analytic SNP heritability ranges from a low of 6.1% for agreeableness to a high of 9.5% for extroversion. On average, it's a moderate, but kind of measly compared to other things, 7.6%. Importantly, though, many questionnaires that measure personality in large biobanks, they lack statistical reliability. So this is a huge issue. If you want to measure extroversion, which is a multifaceted, broad construct, you can't just use one item that says, hey, are you extroverted? You're missing out on a lot of the personality variance there. But when we're in these large biobank studies, oftentimes we're restricted to measuring personality with just 1 or 2 items. Rather than getting at all the contours of a trait, and rather than getting at high reliability by asking about these items multiple times from different angles, we're restricted by just having a couple different items. So what we can do here is disattenuate our measurements for measurement unreliability. We can look at what happens in our best, most reliable measures, and then we can also extrapolate this to say, what would our heritability be if we didn't have all of these crummy measures with really low reliability? What if we had, like, for example, a latent variable that we're measuring? And when we do this, we nearly double our heritability. So accounting for measurement unreliability, we find a very, very strong association by how reliably we're measuring a trait and how heritable it is. It makes sense because something that's not being measured reliably is, by definition, statistical noise. It can't be heritable. So it seems like reliability and personality measurement is a huge issue in these GWAS studies, especially in these biobanks that they're not measuring personality with 200 items or 10, sometimes they're measuring it with 2. So overall here, the general argument that I'm trying to make is that minuscule effects of individual SNPs, those really, really small standardized effect sizes, well, they aggregate to predict substantial total heritability. It's lower than what we find for broad sense heritability estimates, but that's what we would expect. A lot of the variance is going to be hiding in these rare variants that aren't tagged by our SNPs. A lot of the variance is going to be hidden in these interaction effects that we're not modeling here. But this is kind of one of the first times that we're really able to kind of measure actually with reliability what the SNP heritability might be. All right, on to biological characterization. I am not so much of a bio person here, but I'm going to be summarizing the effects that some of my colleagues have been finding with these data. A big problem is that if you have these massively polygenic traits, you can't just characterize individual SNPs. It's useless. I mean, I was telling you about that, like the FOXP2 gene for agreeableness, that explains like 1% of agreeableness genetic effects. So what we really need to do here is we need to subdivide these SNPs into sets with similar biological properties and test if heritability is enriched in each of these sets of SNPs. So looking at kind of this collection of genetic signal and where it's expressed, what genetic variants. One thing that has been theorized about forever, I mean, at least since Phineas Gage got a metal rod through his head and it changed his personality traits, is the importance of the prefrontal cortex. And indeed, we find that genetic variants that are expressed in the prefrontal cortex are relevant to each of the big 5 personality traits. As a person who thinks about personality development and also about how the prefrontal cortex is one of the last brain areas to mature in the human lifespan, we can also kind of maybe connect this a little bit to lifespan theories of human personality development. Perhaps, the prefrontal cortex taking a little bit longer to mature is also why we see these huge conscientiousness increases in our 20s. People become much more responsible as they move through adolescence and emerging adulthood, and perhaps a biological explanation for that is this prefrontal cortex maturation. We've also got some theories about everyone's favorite neurotransmitters, dopamine and serotonin, and the big 5 personality traits. The theory goes something like extroversion and openness are approach-based traits. People want to approach others, people like to approach information, and so those are going to be related to dopamine. And meanwhile, serotonin is related to these kind of self-regulatory traits, things like agreeableness, conscientiousness, and neuroticism. I mean, if we're trying to treat a person who's very depressed and has very high neuroticism, we give them a serotonin reuptake inhibitor. So there's this biological link between serotonin and neuroticism that we've kind of come across through these experimental studies, but we don't really have a very good biological model of these personality variation mapping onto these neurotransmitters. So we can look at the kind of enrichment patterns for dopamine and serotonin and which big 5 traits they're related to, and we don't really find exactly what was theorized. Dopamine seems to be more relevant to extroversion, but also conscientiousness and neuroticism. And serotonin seems to be relevant to neuroticism, but not so much agreeableness and conscientiousness. And also, neuroticism is relevant to 15 other human and mouse brain cell types. So as a person who's not a biologist, my biological understanding of human personality is really impoverished, but I'm realizing that it's mostly because we haven't had good data to elucidate these mechanisms yet. These theories of dopamine and serotonin are coming from SSRI research and research on mouse lesion studies, but finally with this GWAS, we're starting to get into a more complex neurobiological model of personality traits, which of course, like all things human, are very complex and we'll be needing to elaborate in the future. But this GWAS data has finally allowed us to characterize these things because we've been in dopamine serotonin world since about 1991 in personality with few advances. One thing that I think might be of interest to you who study plants and other more sessile organisms is looking at how general genetic effects on personality are. Because of course, people live in different cultures and different countries, and maybe the genetic effects of personality in one culture are different than a different culture. So the way that we're doing this is by looking at genetic correlations. We're looking at whether SNP personality associations are similar or discrepant between group X and group Y. Do the genetic variants that predict being conscientious in one group also predict being conscientious in another group? You can interpret these genetic correlations like phenotypic correlations, but with measurement error taken out, so they're a little bit stronger usually. But just think about them like correlations. So first we looked across different Western geographic regions. So we looked at genetic effects in the US, Nordic countries, UK and Australia. We had to squeeze them together because we didn't have a sample size enough for each one individually, and continental Europe. And the average genetic correlation of personality effects across the big five here is 0.86. So in other words, genetic variants that predict being more conscientious in the US also tend to predict higher levels of conscientiousness other places in the Western world. The big exception here is agreeableness. The genetic correlations across geographic regions for agreeableness, so like being a friendly, compliant, modest individual, were about only 0.65. For the other big five traits, the genetic correlations were a lot higher. And so this speaks to perhaps a larger cultural mediating role in the genetics of agreeableness. The way that I like to think about this is like, to me, people from Britain are a lot more sarcastic. And so if I inherited some genetic variants that for whatever reason predisposed me to sarcasm, in the US, those genetic variants would be correlated with lower agreeableness. But in Britain, those genetic variants would just be correlated with being a sarcastic Brit, which isn't seen as so disagreeable. So this link from personality to, or from genetics to personality through culture might be different for agreeableness than the other did. This is something that we're really excited about because for many of these effects, the big five are all kind of working the same. Agreeableness seems to be a little bit more culturally bound than the other big five in terms of these genetic effects. We also have a huge sample of veterans, the Million Veterans Program. So we can look at genetic correlation between vets and non-vets, people who have combat experience and thus maybe these differential patterns of gene expression based on being in a very high stress environment. But we find a pretty high genetic correlation of 0.8 between the two groups. One thing that I get a lot as a personality psychologist is, well, if people are just studying these things in terms of self-report questionnaires, how do we know that not all of this is just an illusion of the self, right? Am I just marking that I'm extroverted, but that doesn't correspond with anything in reality? Well, the Estonian Biobank had a bunch of best friends and lovers and family members rate the personality traits of the people that were genotyped. So we can look at the genetic correlation between self-reported personality, so how I report on my own personality, with other report personality, how close others report on my personality. And we find a mean genetic correlation of 0.84, suggesting that the genetic architecture from my own perspective is very, very similar to the genetic architecture from close others' perspective. In other words, we live in this kind of consensus reality where it's really, really hard to point at something and say that thing is extroversion. But when we look at a person, we talk to them, we all kind of agree on what an extroverted person is and what they aren't. And then finally, we looked at age groups, which I think is something that's really curious given personality's lifespan development. You might have these genetic effects that turn on at an early age and turn off when people are older. But it turns out that the average genetic correlation for here was about 0.82. So what's nice about these is none of these genetic correlations are exactly one. We've still got this space below one where it indicates there might be some effect of the grouping variable. But they are very, very high, which suggests that it's totally legitimate to combine this sample across these groups in order to have a GWAS. It's not like the genetic effects of personality in veterans and non-veterans are completely separate and should be kept separate. Rather, it suggests that we can combine these things into one big GWAS. All right, yeah, overall effects are highly general, but perhaps less for agreeables. Okay, so next we went on to move to predict personality with polygenic indices. So if SNPs truly tag this heritable signal in personality, well, we're thinking they should predict personality in independent participant samples. We should be able to have another sample that's not part of our GWAS and be able to take our genetic effects and predict their personality from their DNA. So here we're using these polygenic indices, which summarize GWAS effects into a single value for each person. So perhaps this is extremely rudimentary review for you, but maybe SNP1, your GWAS beta is 0.003. You inherit one effect allele, so your estimated effect is 0.003. SNP2, there's a small negative effect. You inherit 2 effect alleles, so we multiply it by 2. So you get negative 0.002 for that SNP. And then SNP3, we've got a larger effect, but you don't inherit any effect alleles, so your PGI doesn't reflect that. We've got our effects from our GWAS here, and then we've got our effects here of applying them to an individual person. And we simply add them up, and then your PGI, based on these 3 SNPs, is 0.001. So we turn our millions of genetic effects into one nice little number for each person, and look at the predictivity of that number. Personality psychologists really love PGIs because they don't know about the genomic part. So if we can just give them PGI values, that's great. So how can we predict personality with PGIs? Well, we've got 5 independent cohorts that were left out of the GWAS that we're trying to predict personality in. So on the y-axis here is our standardized PGI beta. So you can think of it like a standardized correlation from 0 up to 0.25. And then we've got each of the big 5 traits here. And we're predicting in 5 different cohorts, which vary in nationality and also what part of the lifespan they're in. So Ad Health is a sample of US youth. We've also got a German lifespan sample, Dutch youth, US retirees, and UK youth. So we're looking at whether these effects are significant, first of all. In a lot of personality research in the past, we haven't had significant PGIs. And we're also looking at how consistent they are, how similar the bars are going to be across each sample. So for extroversion, we find these quite consistent genetic effects. We find that the genes that a person inherits before they're born can predict their personality trait of extroversion, even in retirement with this red bar in the HRS, of about 0.19, 0.20. It's not a huge effect, it's a moderate effect, but it is quite cool because previous personality PGIs were not working at all. The error bars were overlapping with 0. And it suggests that, if you know a person's DNA before you know any of the many life experiences that they've gone through or will go through, that you can predict their personality reasonably well above chance in a sample when they're retired. For agreeableness, we have a little bit lower SNP heritability and also a little bit less predictive power. Then we find similar consistent prediction across cohorts for conscientiousness, neuroticism, and openness. So in other words, genetic effects on personality are predictive across Western countries and across age groups. So if we know a person's DNA, we've got a big sample of people, we can actually separate which people are likely to score higher or lower. We don't have anything nearly strong enough for individual level prediction, which I think is wonderful. I do not want to be at the level of individual level prediction. That's very scary for personality, actually. This is a really nice sweet spot. Okay, so what do the genes for personality do? Well, we can look at genetic sharing between personality and a whole lot of outcomes. And this is something that I think is really fun because you can just think about all these other GWAS outcomes in the prior literature and just run these genetic correlations with personality traits. For personality and psychopathology, these are kind of some fun probes for shared etiology. In fact, if you're following kind of the literature on psychopathology and mental health more generally, they've been moving towards these diagnostic models for mental health that look more and more like personality traits. Rather than saying you either have a disorder or don't, they're starting to correlate it more with kind of continuous level variation in personality traits. So looking at these 4 different transdiagnostic factors, we've got our genetic correlations here at the bottom, and a few things might pop out to you. The first is that there's this huge correlation between internalizing disorders and neuroticism. In fact, some people have argued that neuroticism just is internalizing disorders, that it's more of a difference in level rather than kind. And we see these really, really strong genetic correlations of about 0.75, even up to 0.85 with major depressive disorder risk. For the compulsive factor, you see this interesting positive correlation with conscientiousness. In fact, you see that conscientiousness seems to be a risk factor for things like eating disorders, which are in some ways typified by overly high conscientiousness and rigidity among eating. What I think is really interesting, though, is we see that openness to experience is related to this cross-cutting liability. So openness to experience predicts higher risk for diagnosis of each of these 4 factors. And this is not something you see phenotypically. So almost always you see this kind of trafficking in tandem of phenotypic and genetic effects. But for openness to experience, there's this really interesting thing that I think a lot of people in the field have started to be curious about, that openness to experience might be predisposing people to genetic levels of risk, but not necessarily phenotypic risk correlations. In terms of thought disorders here, openness is a higher risk factor for thought disorder diagnosis than neuroticism. And in fact, this kind of plays into this interesting pop cultural trope of people who are creative geniuses, that's David Bowie on the left, having first-degree relatives with schizophrenia. That's his brother on the right who has schizophrenia. And in fact, you see this kind of level of openness, this kind of quotidian mad genius hypothesis playing out here with this correlation. As I mentioned before, conscientiousness is linked to liability for compulsive disorders. And then here we're also finding that extroversion is linked to neurodevelopmental disorders. So things like ADHD that tend to occur in childhood and that are especially relevant to hyperactivity. It seems like the genetics of extroversion, which in adulthood are linked to things like being more sociable, and being more risk-taking, are also in childhood linked to these neurodevelopmental risks. We can also look at personality's genetic sharing with other outcomes. One of the things that's most important to me about personality is it relates to pretty much everything. So we see that personality is correlated with physical health, things like COVID infection. Well, why would people who score high on extroversion be more likely to be diagnosed with COVID? They had a hard time social distancing in 2021. Introverts were much better at staying away from other people. Meanwhile, openness to experience is correlated with people's level of education and also their political ideology. And there's this politically asymmetric response to social distancing in the US, where people who are liberal and perhaps higher on openness to experience tended to social distance, where people lower on openness were more likely to ignore those warnings and perhaps be diagnosed with COVID. In other words, the links between personality, genetics, and physical health often play through perhaps these routes by which personality leads to behavioral differences in the real world. You see genetic sharing between personality and survey responses, which is kind of fun. People who say, I don't know on a survey, that is genetically correlated quite highly with neuroticism. And so given that my job is basically looking at survey responses, the fact that there's this kind of confounding factor between neuroticism genetics and opting out of surveys might be something that a problem for our field. On the other hand, you see people who are with the genetic correlation between agreeableness and I don't know is negative. People with agreeableness genetics might be a little bit more compliant, wanting to go along and be like, I'll just play along with this. I'll check a box. And then my favorite finding is you see this genetic association with interviewer perceptions. So in this one sample, the adolescent to adult health, people came in and were interviewed in just this one-shot session. And then after they left, the interviewer rated how attractive their personality was. Scale of 1 to 5, not very attractive personality to very attractive personality. And it turns out that participants, these are polygenic index associations, so we've got these bars. People who inherited a genetic profile associated with higher extroversion, agreeableness, and lower neuroticism tended to be rated by others the first time they met those others as having a more attractive personality. In other words, a person's genetic inheritance is probabilistically related to the way in which others perceive you. Really shows the wide reach of personality. I'm going to go through this real quick, but we've got some accelerometer data, and we see these genetic correlations between how much a person moves across the day. Conscientiousness, people tend to be more active during the daytime when it's great to be responsible. People with high openness tend to be night owls. Personality genetics and residential mobility. You see that people who inherit a genetic profile higher associated with higher openness tend to move into cosmopolitan student neighborhoods and inner city cosmopolitan neighborhoods over their lifespan, whereas people from with higher conscientiousness polygenic indices tend to move out of these cosmopolitan areas and into the suburbs. So openness and conscientiousness and the genetics associated with them are predicting our migration patterns over our lifespan. One big issue, though, is that genetic effects can be environmentally confounded. I'm just looking here at these regression effects of personality traits, of genetic effects on personality traits. So we've got this model where a person's SNP is predicting their neuroticism, but it could be that geography is actually correlated with our genetics and with our personality traits. We see regional variation in personality traits across the US and across the globe. Michigan kind of scores in the middle on neuroticism. And we also see that genetics tend to mirror geography. It's really, really easy to mate with a person who lives geographically proximate to you and harder to mate with someone who lives geographically more distant from you. And so we tend to see genetic similarity mirroring geographical similarity. That suggests that these correlations may indeed be confounding associations. Similarly, there might be a confounded family environment. Perhaps it's not your genetics making you more neurotic, it's your mom's genetics making you more neurotic because she is maybe yelling at you. So we need to account for these confounds some way. And a really elegant way to do this is by using sibling comparisons. In other words, what we're doing here is predicting a person's trait scores from sibling differences in inheritance. You inherited 1 G and your sibling inherits 2 Gs. Does that difference predict your extroversion? What this does is it leverages the fact that inheritance is like an experiment, whether you, your sibling, both of you, or neither of you got these alleles, entirely random. That's how evolution works. And the sibling comparisons hold these major confounds constant. You and your siblings come from the same parents, which holds constant the rearing environment as well as the geographic and genetic population stratification of your parents. So what do genetic effects look like when we predict personality from sibling differences in genotype? Well, for other social science traits like education, cognitive ability, psychiatric disorders, we find this huge shrinkage of genetic effects. We don't know what this looks like yet for personality. So here we're going to run these within family polygenic indices to look at whether accounting for confound shrinks prediction. So here are previous estimates from these polygenic analyses. So this is what I showed you a few slides ago in the Netherlands Twin Registry and the Twins Early Development Study. And then I'm going to show you how much these effects shrink when we account for siblings. For extroversion, they don't shrink at all. For agreeableness, they don't shrink at all. And in fact, for the other big 5 traits, we don't find any shrinkage either. The average reduction in prediction is negative 0.02%. There's basically indistinguishable prediction across these groups. So when we account for these confounds, we're not finding any differences, suggesting there isn't too much confounding. For educational attainment, we see a decline of 45% in prediction. For cognitive ability, we see 18%, and for externalizing, we see 35%. So compared to these other big social science traits, genetic effects on personality are minimally confounded by environment. It suggests that these effects really aren't biased, and that the effects that we think are causal, the effect of the gene on the personality trait, is actually affecting genetic effects rather than these confounding effects masquerading as genetic ones. So one really fun thing you can do is look at parental similarity in personalities as well. So we're looking here at the similarity correlations between trait-associated genetic variants. So what happens here is that if you have, for example, if your mom has a genetic variant related to being agreeable on chromosome 1, and your dad has a genetic variant related to being agreeable on chromosome 2, you're likely to inherit both of those variants. So in other words, this assortative mating, the part that's on a heritable trait, starts to accrue over generations in the genome. And so if we look at genetic correlations across relatives, we can quantify parental similarity going back generations. So we can look at the genome and get evidence for what used to be in terms of parental similarity. So here we took some data from spouses, siblings, and cousins from the UK Biobank and the DECODE data set. We got about 300,000 participants total. What we did with the siblings and the cousins is we transformed the genetic correlations to account for the expected similarity. So in other words, siblings are expected to be related 50%. So we're kind of subtracting 50% from that estimate. And if we look at the spousal correlation in personality, for each of the big 5, we find basically nothing. For agreeableness, we find a correlation of 0.03, agreeableness 0.02, extroversion 0.03, conscientiousness not even significant with 300,000 people, and openness 0.04, which is the largest. We actually find the most assortative mating on openness. We still don't find much. For contrast, if you look at educational attainment, the sibling or the parental correlation on the heritable part is 0.37. So parents tend to resemble quite a bit each other on educational attainment, but they do not tend to resemble each other on personality. This has also been found in a bunch of phenotypic research. And now we can say pretty confidently that birds of a feather do not flock together, and they haven't for at least 10 generations. Kind of surprising. So here are the big takeaways. In the first highly powered GWAS of the Big Five, we show that genetic effects on human personality are especially numerous and individually small. Personality is highly polygenic. In aggregate, they're substantial and robustly predictive. There's a huge environmental component to personality, but we're finding this robust prediction that's similar in magnitude across different cohorts. Biologically, a lot more complex than extant theories, so I'm really excited for kind of personality neuroscience to take this stuff and run with it. And the genetic effects are pretty generalizable across groups. Oh, and they're minimally confounded by environmental effects. The genetics of human personality are really omnirelevant, I would say. They're relevant to psychopathology and health. They're relevant to how a person answers surveys and how others perceive that person. They're relevant to our daily movement and the residential mobility we have across the lifespan. But they are not relevant to mate choice. The genetics of human personality, I think, are minimally confounded, omnirelevant, and quite important to all of us. So thank you to all of our re-GPC members, including the steering committee, support from the NIMH, and the preprint is available online in case you want to learn about any of this in depth. Thank you, guys.